Webster defines crunch time as a critical moment or period, like the end of a game, when decisive action is needed. Every sports fan knows this time in the game. Your palms sweat just a little more, your heart races just a little bit faster, and you live and die with every play until the final seconds tick off the clock and you're either celebrating a victory or disappointed by the defeat. The team at Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network understands just how critical these moments are. For us, it begins as soon as the next set of games are on the board. We evaluate the opening lines and any breaking news throughout the week. We cover each game inside and out, whether it's from inside the locker room to a huddle down on the field, the court, or the ice. We take you inside the meeting room with scouts, coaches, and executives. We have our fingers on the pulse of all the sports that we cover: the National Hockey League, NBA, college basketball, college football, and the National Football League. We are the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network, and we're here to help you find your sports advantage. After all the data has been crunched, we then turn it over to Kenneth for the best analysis around. His unique perspective in both understanding the data and how it applies to the game and how you win is the Crunch Time Sports Advantage. Are you ready? The Crunch Time Jet is fueled and ready for takeoff, and the Crunch Time Express is about to leave the station. Your VIP pass has been approved, so all aboard.
Welcome to the 2024 College Football Team Autopsy Report. An autopsy report is a document that summarizes the findings of an autopsy, an examination of a body after death. It includes details of the examination, tests, and observations performed, as well as the cause and manner of death. Just like a real autopsy report, the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network College Football Autopsy Report examines a team's body of work after the season has concluded. This report includes a review of the team's season win total and whether they met expectations, key offensive, defensive, and special teams metrics that shaped the season, a deep dive into coaching decisions, including situational play and fourth down aggressiveness, a final season grade, evaluating execution, performance in key moments, and consistency, the final verdict, analyzing what went right, what went wrong, and what must be fixed for 2025. With the 2024 season in the rearview mirror, it's time to examine the patient. To present the findings, we have called in our Chief Medical Examiner and Senior Analyst, Kenneth.
And welcome back to the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network. This is the 2024 Team Autopsy Report for the Virginia Cavaliers. Folks, this one is going to be a little bit more challenging because of the background situations that have taken place since head coach Tony Elliott has been the head coach there in Charlottesville, Virginia. Okay, so here's the backstory. His record in 3 years, 11-23. 32% winning percentage, but that doesn't tell the full story. And the reason I say that is because of the shooting death by a former player that took the lives of 3 University of Virginia players. The university, and credit them for making this decision, instead of putting Tony Elliott on the hot seat or terminating him, they felt it was in the best interest of the football program and the university to have him as the head coach there. And we saw this team finally take a step forward last year, going 5-7. So while we say that this is a numbers-driven business from the analytics side of it, which it truly is, there's also a real-life human element that sometimes has to be taken into account when doing some of these evaluations. So we'll look at the on-field product for the Virginia Cavaliers in 2024 and see if we can start to see some signs of this university getting to where they want to get to, and that would be getting to a bowl game this year. So let's start with the betting aspect of it. First of all, this team in June had a season win total of 4.5, exceeded that. So that's one encouraging sign. When we look at our composite win total, 3 in-season statistical categories make this number up for us. We actually had them just a tick better at 4.7. So again, exceeding that expectation. Now, let's take a look at the strength of schedule and strength of record, 2 very important data points, and we'll explain to you how we kind of come about there. The strength of schedule, you can control, for the most part, your non-conference schedule. So roughly for these college football teams that play in these bigger conferences, you're looking at maybe 3 to 4 games a year to where you really have some control over. Your in-conference schedule is literally the luck of the draw as far as who you draw in your conference. When we look at Virginia, 0.491, that was the 33rd toughest schedule in Division I college football last year, 134 teams. Now, when we look at their strength of record, this is something you absolutely have no control over. It's how do your opponents perform throughout the regular season last year. 0.599. This was the 23rd best strength of record in college football. So not only did Virginia play a quality schedule last year, their opponents put a lot of wins on the board. We'll get to that here in just a moment. If you're listening on the podcast platform, everything that I'm going to reference here on the screen, I got you covered there. If you're watching on YouTube or watching on our Twitter feed at Crunchtime VIP, thank you as well. All right, so I mentioned their strength of record being 23rd, and that really shows up here in the win-loss record for their opponents. Now, FCS opponent in Richmond, so we discount that. Wake Forest was 4-8, Maryland 4-8. And you're thinking, well, that doesn't sound too tough, but wait till we get a little bit deeper here. Coastal Carolina was 6-6, Boston College 7-5, Louisville 8-4, Clemson 9-3, UNC 6-6, Pitt 7-5, Notre Dame and SMU both 11-1, and rounding out the regular season with in-state rival there in Virginia Tech at 6-6. So starts off a little bit shaky, but you can see once they really kind of got into conference play, that win-loss record really stepped up. So as we always like to do is we want to look at how good were the defenses that this Virginia team went up against last year. We use a baseline number for this season at 68 because that's how many Power 4 teams that we had in Division I football last year. The 4 super conferences and then Notre Dame. So this team did not face a team with inside of the top 68 until they got into conference play. Now, Boston College was 55th. Louisville was 40th. Clemson 35th. Best defense in college football for us last year. Pitt was 56. Notre Dame was the 9th best defense in college football for us last year. SMU was 34th and Virginia Tech was 28th. So once this team got into conference play, only North Carolina was outside of that top 68. Now, let's take a look at the NCAA average. Virginia's raw accounting data and then adjusted for opponent in some of these major categories here. Average team last year scored about 28 points per game. Virginia, whether it's in their raw accounting numbers or our adjusted offensive points, 22.7 and 22.8. So virtually identical there when we adjust for opponent. The average team threw the ball for about 227 yards per game last year. Virginia on the book says 229. We actually had them just a little bit less at 200 yards per game. So a 29 yard per game regression there. But it's offset by their rushing numbers just a little bit. Average team last year ran the ball for about 160 yards last year. Virginia was at 132. When we adjust for opponent, we actually have them at 159 yards per game. So about a 27 yard per game improvement there. As far as total offense per game, average team was about 387 last year. Virginia was at 361. And when we adjust that for opponent, just a slight decrease there at 359 yards per game. So below the NCAA average, about, let's call it about 25 yards per game, but not horrible. Now we'll get to where this team has really got to improve on the offensive side of the ball here. So average team last year, drives ending with a score. That's either a touchdown or a field goal. Average team last year, about 40% of their drives ended with some kind of points on the board from their offense. Virginia just a tick below that at 38%, so about 2 percentage points. Drives ending with a touchdown. The difference in wins and losses is the difference in kicking field goals and scoring touchdowns. Average team last year, about 29% ended drives with a touchdown. Virginia was at 25%. So about 4 percentage points off of that mark. And then converting on third downs, average team was about 39%. Virginia was at 36% on third downs. Now, this team did a horrible job in protecting the quarterback. Average team either sacked or allowed sacks last year at 20, let's call it 23 and a half sacks on the season. This Virginia offensive line and the quarterback gave up 45 sacks last year, so almost double what the average team gave up last year. And then you combine that with 19 turnovers. If you take care of the quarterback and not have so many negative plays, that's when you can start to find some offensive consistency. Now, let's take a look at our 3 E's. How effective, how explosive, and how efficient was this Virginia offense last year? 99th effective ranking last year, 104th in explosive offense, and then 93rd as far as efficiency goes. Virginia ended the regular season as our 98th ranked offense in college football last year. So plenty of work for Tony Elliott to do on the offensive side of the ball. Now let's take a look at that defense and see if there's any positive notes we can take from their performance last year. This team gave up about 28.8 points per game, but when we adjust that for opponent, actually goes down to about 24.7. So about a 4-point improvement there when we adjust for opponent. Can definitely be encouraged by that. As far as their passing yards per game allowed, 361 yards per game. When we adjust that for opponent, actually goes down to about 251 yards per game. So again, an improvement of about 12 and a half yards per game there by their pass defense. Run defense was just a little bit better than the NCAA average, 145 yards per game. When we adjust that for opponent, about 143. Now, still, total offense allowed per game needs to come down. NCAA average about 371 yards per game. Virginia gave up about 408 yards per game in total offense. When we adjust that for opponent, goes down to about 393. So when we start adjusting for opponents, we start to see that this Virginia defense was just a little bit better than what their raw accounting stats show, but still some work to be done there. Now, as far as their opponents' drives ending with a score, 41% of the time there, so about a 1 percentage point difference there from the NCAA average. As far as their opponents' drives ending with a touchdown, 25%, so just a little bit better than the NCAA average, and then also just a tick better on third down conversions when we adjust it, 38% versus 39% from the NCAA average. need to do a little bit better job of getting after the opponent's quarterbacks. Only 19 sacks last year. As far as their opponents converting on fourth downs, 21 attempts, 12 conversions. So 57% conversion rate by their opponents last year. And then only forcing 15 turnovers. So there is some hope there for Virginia. And I did this out of sequence, and I do apologize for that. Let's go back and look at the quality of offenses that this Virginia defense faced last year after giving you their raw counting numbers. So, once again, using that baseline of 68, how many of their opponents were inside of that number? Maryland was 60th, Boston College 54th, Louisville 18th best offense in college football last year. Clemson was 13th. North Carolina was 40th. Pitt, 65th. Notre Dame, 4th best offense in college football for us last year. SMU was 10th best, and Virginia Tech, 34th. So 9 of their opponents were inside of that top 68. And all of their conference games were inside of that top 68. So this team faced much better offenses last year. So their struggles can glean a little bit of hope from that. And when we look at what they did in conference last year, some of those losses, really anemic performances by their offense and giving up far too many points by the defense. That's something that I think our numbers are going to bear out once we do a little bit deeper dive here in their offensive splits between games that they won and games that they lost. So if I had to bullet point their offense last year, I would say struggled with passing consistency last year. This team just could not generate enough big plays out of the passing game. Now, some of their strengths last year on offense, solid rushing attack, scoring efficiency was okay. It definitely needs to improve, but not completely horrible there. And then when I bullet point this defense, weak pass defense and their run defense held up okay. Now, let's get back to the 3 E's for their defense. How effective was this defense last year? How was this defense in not giving up explosive plays? And how efficient was this defense? Last year, the Virginia Cavaliers were our 61st rated defense as far as effectiveness last year. As far as explosive plays given up, they were 79th. And as far as efficiency on defense, 71st. The Virginia Cavaliers were our 68th rated defense last year. And like I said, they faced a real high quality of offenses last year. So the fact that their metrics show a little bit of encouragement there is something that this fan base can kind of get behind just a little bit. All right, let's take a look at the coaching and situational play. And we'll start with this team went 2-1 in one-score games. So situational play was solid. 0-5 against quality opponents. And I would venture to say losing those games in conference certainly had a major impact on that. And then when we look at the turnover differential, -4, that puts you in the 99th ranking as far as turnover differential. You've got to get better at taking care of the ball and absolutely doing a much better job of taking the ball away. This team did not beat themselves with penalties. 5.4 penalties per game, only 47 yards in penalties there. So this team is not making a lot of unforced errors, as we like to say. So that's something, once again, you can kind of be encouraged by. Let's take a look at the special teams unit. And I would say this was one of the strengths of the team from last year. 16 out of 18 field goal attempts, almost an 89% conversion rate there. So fantastic job. Converted all of their extra points. Now, you want to see this number come down. They average 5 punts per game. You want to have that number under 5 per game, because you're giving your opponents a lot more scoring opportunities there. So that coincides with the offense not giving up so many sacks and converting a little bit better on third downs. You want to not give your opponents a lot of shots at the apple there. As far as the former Clemson offensive coordinator, now head coach there for Virginia, as far as going for it on fourth downs, 14% of the time in a fourth down opportunity, Tony Elliott would go for it. That puts him 66th out of 144 Division I team qualifying coaches last year. This team converted 14 out of 26 attempts. So right there on average with what the average team would have converted last year at 53%. So solid there. Now, let's take a look at those splits as I talked about. How did this team do when they won and how did they do when they lost on the offensive side of the ball? Then we'll jump over to the defense. All right, so in those 5 wins, 31.2 points per game, attempted only 29 pass attempts per game for 230, let's call it 237 yards per game, 8.2 yards per passing attempt, 11.9 yards per completion. This team did a fantastic job of running the ball when they won. 41 rushing attempts per game last year for 190 yards per game, 4.6 yards per rushing attempt. Like I said, you want to be at least 4.5 yards per rush or better, and that 8 yards per passing attempt is pretty much in line with where you want to be from an offensive standpoint. This team, when they won, averaged about 3.4 touchdowns per game and just 1 turnover per game. I talked about the balanced offense. Balance for them is leaning more on the run than the pass. Let's call it 59% run, 41% pass. When they won, converted about 37% on third down, so not great, but converted almost 78% on their fourth down attempts, and only committed 5 turnovers in those 5 wins. So just 1 turnover per game, as I mentioned. Now, in those 7 losses, offense really kind of sputtered, 16.6 points per game. The passing attempts went up significantly, up to, let's call it 37 passing attempts per game. Yet the passing yards per game went down to 234 yards per game, 6.1 yards per passing attempt, 10.6 yards per completion. More passing attempts led to fewer rushing attempts, 32 rushing attempts per game, and the rushing yardage cut in half, 91 yards per game rushing, 2.8 yards per rushing attempt. So the average plays per game for Virginia last year were virtually the same. It was all about the run pass distribution and the execution of that running game. This team went from 3.4 touchdowns per game in those wins down to 1.9 touchdowns per game in the losses, and turnovers went from 1 to 2 turnovers per game. The fourth down conversion attempts went up to 17 attempts in those losses. The conversion went down to 41%. And I talked about it. Turnovers in 7 games, committed 14 turnovers. Now, let's take a look at their defense of splits here. And in those 5 wins, defense was giving up 20 points per game. Opponents passing attempts about, let's call it 32 and a half attempts per game for 247 yards, 7.6 yards per passing attempt, 13.4 yards per completion. Their opponents were running the ball attempt-wise about 33 rushing attempts per game for 112 yards per game, 3.4 yards per attempt. Opponents were only averaging 2.2 touchdowns per game and almost 2 turnovers per game. So defense was really standing on their heads in those 5 wins. Opponents had a difficult time converting on 4th downs. In those 5 wins, Virginia's opponents converted 40% on 4th down. And I mentioned the turnovers, 9 forced turnovers in those 5 wins. In the 7 losses, defense struggled along with the offensive struggles to work hand in hand, 35 points per game. Passing attempts virtually identical at 32.7 passing attempts per game. Passing yards go up a little bit to 275 yards per game, 8.4 yards per attempt, 12.7 yards per completion. But here's the biggest difference. Their opponents, when this defense lost, 37 rushing attempts, but the yardage, 169 yards per game, 4.6 yards per rushing attempt. Their opponents, a little bit better conversion rate on 3rd downs, up to 43% versus the 35% in those wins that they had. And opponents converted at much higher rate on 4th downs, 73% conversion rate by their opponents in those 7 losses. Only managed 6 total turnovers in those ball games. So what went wrong for Virginia last year? Well, we talked about it. The passing game struggled. 229 yards per game passing, the inefficiency on 3rd downs, protecting the quarterback, giving up 45 sacks, among the worst in the FBS last year, and then pass defensive weaknesses, allowed too many yards through the air last year. Now, let's get to the final grade here. The Virginia Cavaliers and head coach Tony Elliott will get a C+ from us here at the Crunch Time Sports Advantage Network. The reason we like the rushing attack, we like the special teams, the passing game got to be a little bit more consistent, and certainly that can be echoed for their poor pass defense. The final verdict, Virginia was a competitive team that exceeded expectations slightly, but issues in pass protection as well as defensive inefficiencies prevented them from becoming bowl eligible in 2025. So as we finish up here with about a minute or so to go, let's give you 3 keys here for what Virginia has to do in 2025 if they want to get back to a bowl game. 1, you got to improve pass protection and preventing those sacks. I talked about it, 45 sacks. You absolutely got to cut that number in half going into 2025. Key number 2, you must strengthen that pass defense. And you do that by a couple of things: controlling the ball more often, and then not giving up those big chunk plays. You got to keep everything in front of you. Maybe look at playing some different coverages, committing a little bit less in the box, and really kind of looking to take away some of these number 1 and number 2 targets for some of these teams. And you must tackle. Missed tackles will cause that yards per completion to skyrocket. And then key number 3, must develop a more consistent passing game. I talked about it this past season. Their quarterback really did not perform well, completed less than 62% only 2,100 yards passing, 13 passing touchdowns, 11 INTs. Got to get much more consistent and quality play out of your quarterback. If the Virginia Cavaliers can do this, they can absolutely find themselves competing for a bowl game in 2025.
Thank you for tuning into this podcast. We hope you enjoyed today's episode and our deep dive into all things college football. Don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show on your favorite podcast platform. And if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button. You can follow us on Twitter at CrunchTimeVIP for updates, insights, and more content. And make sure to visit our website at CrunchTimeSportsAdvantage.com for in-depth blogs, game previews, and information about our Crunch Time Express handicapping packages. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time for our next patient on the 2024 College Football Autopsy Report.